We have this message from Sir David Ormsby Gore, who is the British ambassador to the United States. He said, "This horrible, wicked, and senseless act has deprived not only the American people, but the world of a great and wonderful man." Jack Kennedy, the British ambassador continued, was the best and most loyal friend that one could ever hope to have, and I feel... We are receiving reaction from around the world, and I believe, if I'm correct, that we have a voice report from NBC's Wells, Hangen, and Bond. Is that correct? Can I be advised on that? We do or do not have? Well, we'll get the word in just a moment if you'll bear with us here. We do have it, Bill. I'm sorry. Here is a report from NBC's Bonn correspondent, Wells, Hangen, bringing us the reaction of the West German government.
West Germany has ordered alert condition number 1 for all its armed forces, fearing an aggressive Russian move in the wake of President Kennedy's assassination. Sources here confirmed that West Germany's 400,000-man army has been ordered on combat alert, the highest condition short of actual war, following receipt of the news of the president's death. Meanwhile, Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, who's been in office only 5 weeks, returned here by train from a 2-day visit to Paris. He's expected to issue a statement shortly on the president's death. Erhard was due to visit the United States, leaving here Sunday night, but he's now expected to cancel his trip. Former Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, who had criticized Mr. Kennedy's strategy of peace, said today his work will live in history. He has given his life for freedom and peace. Wells Hangen, NBC News, Bonn.
Report was from NBC's Wells, Hangen, and Bonn. He advised us that the West German Air Force has been put on the state of highest alert, the highest alert short of actual warfare. The belief there in West Germany is that the Soviet Union might attempt to make some move at this time when the United States and consequently the Western world has been caught off balance. A report from NBC's Wells, Hangen in Bonn.
Frank, there is this. We are advised that President Johnson, after his return to Washington, which is expected in about 45 minutes, will meet at the White House tonight with Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and with McGeorge Bundy, who had been President Kennedy's top advisor, the White House National Security Aide. And then President Johnson will confer with the bipartisan leadership of the Congress. But they will be brought in. From the Vatican City, a report that Pope Paul VI prayed tonight for President Kennedy. Pope received the news just a few moments after the president died. Pope Paul received the president in audience in Rome June 2nd during the president's trip through there. We now have reaction from the United Kingdom, and for that we go to NBC correspondent Kenneth Bernstein in London.
News sent Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas Hume hurrying back to Downing Street from a dinner party 40 miles out in the country. An official announcement says he learned the news with the most profound shock and horror. Later tonight, the Prime Minister and opposition leader Harold Wilson will appear on radio and television with tributes to President Kennedy. Harold Wilson has called John Kennedy a good friend of this country, a great world statesman, and a great fighter for peace. Queen Elizabeth II was immediately informed, and a statement is expected shortly from Buckingham Palace. A small crowd has gathered outside the American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, London. One man from Connecticut said he just wanted to be a little closer to America in this moment of disaster. News flashes have been interrupting the regular programs on British radio and television, and the members of a panel on one radio show declined to go on out of deference to the president. One panelist, Lord Boothby, said, "The blow that has fallen tonight is for me the most shattering of all." Kenneth Bernstein, NBC News, London.
Not to belabor what has happened today, but perhaps to catch some of you up who may not have heard in as reasonably full detail as we can bring you what has happened today. President Kennedy was assassinated this afternoon by a sniper who hit him with a rifle bullet fired from the 6th floor of a building near a freeway in Dallas, Texas, as the president's motorcade was moving to a trade center where he was to make a speech. Briefly, the president's day as it started in Texas. This morning in Fort Worth, he went to a group of Democrats who couldn't get tickets to see him at a breakfast appearance and apologized that his wife was not along. He said she was organizing herself and it takes longer. Short time later, the President and Mrs. Kennedy went to a breakfast in the Hotel Texas, again in Fort Worth, which was sponsored by the city's Chamber of Commerce. Mrs. Kennedy arrived late, and the entire room rose and gave her a standing ovation. The President then remarked that she takes longer to get prepared in the morning, but that it is worth it. Then, later in the day, the President took off from Fort Worth and made the short flight to Dallas Love Field. There, he and Mrs. Kennedy, Texas Governor John Connally, and Mrs. Connally got into an automobile, a motorcade formed, and proceeded down the freeway, headed for the Trade Center where the President was to make a speech. At approximately 12:30 Dallas time, that would be 1:30 Eastern Standard Time, a bullet hit the President, we believe in the head. He suffered a wound at least in the right temple. Within 5 minutes, the motorcade had broken up, and he was in the emergency room of Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas. Within 30 minutes of the time the bullet struck him, the President of the United States was dead. That, briefly, is the chronology of what happened today in Dallas, Texas, to the President of the United States. Now, further developments, further movements in this story come from the nation's capital. For those, we go to NBC's Ray Scherer in Washington.
I left the Capitol a few minutes ago to come here to the White House. As I left the Capitol, Senate Majority Leader Mansfield and Senate Minority Leader Dirksen were leaving the Capitol to go to Andrews Air Force Base by limousine to greet President Johnson. When President Johnson arrives at the airport, he will make a statement, which you will see on NBC television. He will then come to the White House, where he will hold his first meeting as president. He will meet with Secretary of Defense McNamara and McGeorge Bundy, the President's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs. They will brief the President on the world situation. At 8 o'clock tonight, President Johnson will meet with the leaders of Congress, presumably here in the White House. The funeral arrangements have just been announced inside here by Acting Press Secretary Andrew Hatcher. The President's body, the late President's body, will lie in repose in the East Room tomorrow. At 10 o'clock, the body will be viewed by the family. At 11 o'clock, by Vice President Johnson, the Speaker of the House, and members of the executive branch of the Cabinet. At 2 o'clock, by the Supreme Court. At 2:30, by members of the Senate and the House. At 5 o'clock, by members of the Diplomatic Corps. Ray Scherer, NBC News, at the White House.
As we have attempted to sort out our thoughts here as this afternoon has worn on, it occurs to us that perhaps within the last month, certainly within the last 45 days, the actual chief executive or head of government of all of the major Western allies, save France, has been changed. Britain has changed prime ministers, with Harold Macmillan retiring because of illness, to be replaced by the new prime minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume. A new government has been formed in Italy. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer is no longer the head of the West German state. He has been replaced by Chancellor Erhard. And now the assassination of the President of the United States being replaced by the Vice President, now the President, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So 4 of the 5 major Western allies have undergone a change in their head of government within, as we say, about the last 45, perhaps 30 days, leaving only General Charles de Gaulle of France, who has long since been the last active figure brought over from World War II. The plane with the President Johnson and the late President Kennedy is on its way to Washington, will arrive at Andrews Air Force Base shortly. The new president is expected to make a short statement upon arrival. Lee Oswald, the prime suspect in the assassination, is under arrest, being questioned by police in Dallas. We have no late word on the progress of that. We are bringing you, as we are able to get the material prepared, the reaction from some of the world's capitals. And we have a report now from NBC's John Chancellor, who is in Berlin.
The news of the president's death swept across Berlin. The telephone exchange reported that it was swamped with calls and some of the equipment wouldn't work. As the news spread, people walked out into the streets on a cold and rainy night, asking one another if it was really true. In the restaurants along the Kurfürstendamm, the main street in West Berlin, customers gathered around radio and television sets. Most people watched for a while and then left their meals unfinished and just went home. At least one of the legitimate theaters in West Berlin stopped its performance in the middle announced the tragic news and canceled the evening's performance. A dance festival was stopped in a similar way, and a show at the West Berlin Sports Palace was halted by the news. Mayor Willy Brandt of West Berlin asked the people of the city to put candles in their windows tomorrow night in memory of the American president who had so eloquently, and only a few months ago, pledged his affection and allegiance to this city. Mayor Brandt, who is expected to go to the United States for the funeral, said tonight that with the first citizen of the free world, Berlin has lost its best friend. Students from Berlin's Free University tonight will stage a midnight memorial march through the center of West Berlin. They will march on some of the streets traveled by the president when he visited this encircled city in June. The student march will end at the Schöneberg Rathaus, the city hall where Mr. Kennedy made his famous "I am a Berliner" speech. Tonight, on a cold and rainy night, other West Berliners mourn him. There have been reports in Berlin that the West Berlin police are on the alert for any demonstrations that might take place near the Berlin Wall. The police refuse to confirm this report.
We would like to take you back a bit earlier in the day now and pick up something of the chronology and bring you some of the immediate reaction of those persons who were actually eyewitnesses to the tragedy. The president's motorcade actually had passed, as far as we understand, had passed a thickly populated area where there had been great crowds of people lining the street, and had gotten into a relatively thinly populated area. Was moving along at a rather brisk pace along a freeway in Dallas, Texas, heading toward a market area where he was scheduled to make a speech. So there were not, in fact, a great many of people at this line of the motorcade. So each person there could see quite well what happened. One of those present was a Dallas man who had his 5-year-old son with him, and he was approached by a newsman in Dallas shortly after the shooting and gave an emotional accounting of what he had seen.
Hundreds of persons witnessed the shooting in Dallas just after the noon hour. We have films of eyewitness reports. Coming up is a statement by Charles Brand, who was on the sidewalk and saw the shooting.
Unfortunately, I was probably 15 to 20 feet away from the president when it happened to him.
Tell us exactly what you saw, sir.
He was coming down the street, and my 5-year-old boy and myself were by ourselves on the grass there on Palmer Street, and I asked Joe to wave to him, and Joe waved, and I waved, and the man...
It's all right, sir.
You go ahead and say it. As he was waving back, he was... The shot rang out, and he slumped down in the seat, and his wife reached up toward him, and as he was slumping down, and the second shot went off, and it just knocked him down from the seat. There's 2 shots. 2 shots.
Did you see the man who did this?
No, sir, I did not see the man who did it. All I did was look in the man's face when he was shot there and saw that expression on his face and grab himself and slide. And the second one, whenever it went, why, I'm positive it had hit him. I hope it didn't, but I'm positive it had hit him, and he went all the way down in the car. Then they speeded up, and I didn't know what was going on, so I just grabbed the boy and fell on him in the hopes that there wasn't a maniac around me. I'm sorry. I can't help you more, but I won't forget it.
Bill, we have a few additional details on what took place aboard the Air Force jet as it was still at the airport in Dallas for the swearing in of President Johnson. He, of course, had been sped away from the hospital where President Kennedy had died just moments before. When he left, we did not know where he was going nor the route that he would take to get there. Security officials said later that this was for security reasons. When he arrived at the plane, he was, in fact, President of the United States, but he had not been sworn in, and the judge had been taken to the field to perform this ceremony. However, President Johnson decided to delay the ceremony until Mrs. Kennedy, who was still at the hospital, could arrive back at the plane. When she did arrive, the ceremony was staged in the executive lounge of the airplane, and President Johnson, with his right hand raised and his left hand on a small Bible that had been provided for the ceremony, took the oath of office as President of the United States. Standing on his right was his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, And on his left, what can only be described as a stunned and grief-stricken Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy. Immediately the ceremony was over, Dallas Police Chief J.E. Curry, who had driven with President Johnson to the airport, turned to the First Lady and said, "The whole nation mourns your husband, but God bless you, little lady. You ought to go back and lie down." Mrs. Kennedy said, "No, thanks, I'm fine," and stayed where she was for a moment, but a few moments later she did go to another part of the airplane, the compartment containing the body of the president, which was in a casket, and the reports are that she spent most of the return flight there along with the body of her husband.
This is the announced order given from the White House this evening. The plane is due in roughly a half hour or so, about 6:05 at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, carrying President Johnson and the body of President Kennedy. At 10 tomorrow morning in the East Room of the White House, the President's family will go in to view the body. At 11 o'clock, President Johnson, Speaker of the House McCormick, and members of the executive branch who hold presidential appointments. At 2 tomorrow afternoon, members of the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary will go in to view the body. At 2:30, members of the Senate, the House of Representatives, the governors of the 50 states and of the territories. And at 5 tomorrow afternoon, the body will be viewed by members of the diplomatic corps. There is still no formal word from the White House on when the public will be permitted to view the president's body. At the executive mansion, they are thinking that the body will lie in state at the Capitol later for that purpose, possibly Sunday or Monday, and still yet to be determined, with the family understandably trying to cope with what happened today rather than trying to look forward to arrangements for what must be done in the future. There is still no firm word of where final services for the president will take place, nor is there yet any decision on where the president will be buried. There is, of course, the tradition of ceremonies in the Capitol, burial at Arlington for the president. There is also the fact that the president is from Massachusetts, that the family has exceedingly strong ties to and in the state, and it might well be that the president's family will desire that the Mass, the Requiem Mass, be said in Boston, perhaps by Cardinal Cushing, who is an extremely close friend of the Kennedy family, and that the president may go to his final resting place in the Kennedy family plot in Massachusetts. Frank?
Just to say, Bill, that the family is gathering, so to speak. The president's younger brother, Ted Kennedy, Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts, was, as it happened, actually presiding over that body this afternoon when he received word of the assassination of his brother in Dallas. And he left immediately. He was joined by a sister, the wife of Sergeant Shriver, head of the Peace Corps. And they flew immediately to Massachusetts to be with the president's mother and father, who are there. The two Kennedy children were at the White House at the time. We still do not know if they have learned of their father's passing.
We are told, Frank, in reports they have not.
They have not, fine. There was a suggestion earlier that they would leave that for Mrs. Kennedy.
Yes, sir.
And the president's maternal grandmother, who is 98 years old and lives in Massachusetts, has not been informed of the passing of her grandson. We have some reaction now from the Soviet Union. Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko telephoned United States Ambassador Foy D. Kohler at midnight at the embassy residence in Moscow to express his shock and greatest sympathy to the American peoples. He told the ambassador official condolences will be conveyed later at the highest level. Well, this obviously was a reference to Soviet Premier Khrushchev. The people of Russia have been told of the passing of President Kennedy. We do not as yet have any formal expression from the Soviet leadership. Pope Paul VI in Rome, who was visited by President Kennedy shortly after his coronation in Italy earlier this year, has made some comment on the passing of the president. A report on that now from NBC's correspondent in Rome, Irving R. Levine.
Pope Paul VI has just sent this message to the American people. We are profoundly stricken by the tragic and sad news of the assassination of the President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and of the grave wounding of Governor Conley. We are profoundly saddened by such a shocking crime, by the mourning which strikes through its leader, a great and civilized country, by the sorrow which afflicts Mrs. Kennedy, her children, and all her relatives. Pope Paul's message continues, we deplore with all our hearts this event. We express the hope that the death of this great statesman will not bring damage to the American people, but will reinforce their moral and civil sense and strengthen their sentiments of nobility and of peace. We pray to God that the sacrifice of John Kennedy will aid the cause promoted by him for the defense of the liberty of peoples and of peace in the world. The Pope's message goes on. He was the first Catholic president of the United States. We remember to have had the honor of his visit and to have found in him great wisdom and high ideals for the welfare of humanity. Tomorrow we will offer a holy mass for the peace of his soul, for the comfort of those who mourn his death, and so that not hatred, but love will reign among the human race. That is the message to the American people from Pope Paul VI.
A message from Pope Paul VI in Rome, relayed by NBC's Rome correspondent Irving R. Levine. Not only was Mr. Kennedy the first Catholic president of the United States, he was the youngest, and his administration, which did not fill out its 4-year term, will perhaps be best remembered by the extremely serious challenge to this country and indeed to the entire Western world, represented by the Soviet installation of guided missiles on the island of Cuba in October of last year. The president's response to that situation won him praise from all the leaders of the Western world. In the field of foreign affairs, it is perhaps true that history will record this as his most significant achievement. In the field of domestic affairs, although it's presumptuous to guess about these matters, it would certainly seem to his contemporaries that his being confronted with and the reaction of his administration to the Negro drive for equal rights in this country will perhaps be listed as the major challenge to his administration. We have a reaction also from, do you have hard information, Bill? Please go ahead.
I literally do not know, Frank.
All right, you check it over while
Well, I know what it is, but I don't know if it's hard information. It's the last 3 paragraphs of the speech Mr. Kennedy was to deliver this afternoon in Dallas just before he was shot.
Why don't you go ahead and recite them?
My dear friends and fellow citizens, I cite these facts and figures to make it clear that America today is stronger than ever before. Our adversaries have not abandoned their ambitions. Our dangers have not diminished. Our vigilance cannot be relaxed. But now we have the military, the scientific, and the economic strength to do whatever must be done for the preservation and promotion of freedom. That strength will never be used in pursuit of aggressive ambitions. It will always be used in pursuit of peace. It will never be used to promote provocations. It will always be used to promote the peaceful settlement of disputes. We in this country, in this generation, are, by destiny rather than choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time, and for all time, the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill toward men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waiteth but in vain. The last 3 paragraphs of the speech President Kennedy was on his way to deliver when he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas this afternoon. Frank?
Now we would like to remind you again that NBC's regular programs have been canceled for the remainder of this broadcast day. We will, however, remain on the air to bring you all developments as promptly as we receive them in the wake of the assassination of our president. Now we pause for station identification. As I started to say a moment ago, we have this reaction from Sir Winston Churchill, the wartime leader of the United Kingdom. He said tonight that the assassination of President Kennedy is a monstrous act which has taken from us a great statesman and a wise and valiant man. A World War II leader who will be 89 years old on the 30th of November. He issued a statement from his London residence after listening to television accounts of the president's death. The loss to the United States and to the world is incalculable, Sir Winston declared. Those who come after Mr. Kennedy must strive the more to achieve the ideals of world peace and human happiness and dignity to which his presidency was dedicated. A spokesman for Sir Winston said he and Lady Churchill sat up past 10 p.m. to keep in touch with developments over television, which is quite a late hour for a gentleman of his age. We also have a reaction from New Jersey's Governor Hughes. I believe this is voice only. Is that correct? I believe that's correct. We would like you to hear now the comments of New Jersey Governor Hughes on the passing of President Kennedy.
I share with my countrymen today a shock and grief which defies description. A young and fearless American has died in the service of his country, even as many years ago his body absorbed the wounds of battle in the name of freedom. Now John Kennedy belongs to history, and his courageous spirit joins the fellowship of those who never flinched in the doing of right and in the search for justice. May God bless him and his family and the America he loves so deeply. To President Johnson, now assuming the burdens of an office on which rest the hopes of all humanity, go the prayers and dedication of every one of us.
Richard J. Hughes, governor of New Jersey, and his reaction to the death of President Kennedy. To remind you, the plane bringing President Johnson, who has been sworn into office, back to Washington, and transporting also the body of the late President John F. Kennedy, should be nearing Washington now, as a matter of fact. It is scheduled to arrive at Andrews Air Force Base, which is just outside the nation's capital, at 5 minutes past 6 Eastern Standard Time this evening, which is a matter of some 15 or 20 minutes. NBC has a mobile unit there. It is our thought that we will bring you pictures from the scene as the plane comes in to make its landing. We have been advised that President Johnson will have some remarks to make at the airport, and that later in the evening he will meet with Democratic leaders of Congress at the White House. Bill?
There is some additional background on this suspect who has been picked up in Dallas, Frank. Dallas police official Captain Ganaway said the suspect, Lee Oswald, being questioned both in the shooting of a Dallas policeman who was fatally injured and in the killing of the president. Now, according to a man from the Cuban Student Directory in New Orleans, this man Oswald was in New Orleans 2 months ago as the chairman of a pro-Castro Fair Play for Cuba committee. Oswald and several Cubans were arrested 2 months ago in New Orleans for passing out allegedly pro-communist literature. Member of the Information Council of the Americas, Edward Butler, said he and Oswald once debated communism. He said that Oswald had renounced U.S. citizenship, went to the Soviet Union to marry a Russian. What we know about this man, aside from this political background, is this: that he was in a gunfight with 2 Dallas policemen this afternoon, that he allegedly killed one of them, that the other captured him, that at the time he was captured he said something like, "It's all over now." Excuse me. It is also said that he was employed in the building from which the bullet that killed President Kennedy was fired. There was found in the building a rifle, a high-powered rifle with a telescopic sight on it, and remnants of some chicken near a 5th-floor window. People who were in the motorcade saw a rifle being withdrawn from that window, and it is the supposition that whoever killed the president staked himself out as a sniper, provided himself with food, and just sat there waiting for the motorcade to pass by. At the time the motorcade came into rifle view of the building, if that is the term, we are told by NBC's Robert McNeil, who was in the motorcade, that it was traveling at about 10 to 15 miles an hour, moving fairly slowly. It was only about 100 yards from the president's car to the building, with a telescopic sight and a high-powered rifle. That is very little distance. Frank?
I was just glancing at some of the pictures that we have available to us here, or that we are lining up for whatever conceivable use that we might be able to put them to. And we see so many pictures made of President Kennedy and the First Lady, Mrs. Kennedy, in the early stages of their trip in Texas. Of course, they're both young. It's one of the things that made them extremely attractive to a great many Americans and others around the world, and very much alive. And they seem to be enjoying this trip in Texas enormously. Mrs. Kennedy, we are told, this was really her first, what you would say, all-out effort to become a political campaigner. The indications were that their campaign plans for 1964 called for her to play quite a prominent role. She was active in the president's first campaign as much as she could. She was removed from that arena quite early so that she might bring them their second child, the boy, John. And this is a picture now, as a matter of fact, made of them earlier, both in profile. She's smiling, the president looking straight ahead. And by all accounts, she was enjoying herself, this first real exposure to campaigning. And of course, the day resolved itself so tragically for her. But the information that we have is that she conducted herself in absolutely impeccable fashion for the circumstances. That she was, of course, sitting with the president when the bullet struck him. She exclaimed, "My God, he's hit." She dropped to the bottom of the seat. It's a jump car. It has jump seat, has quite an area of foot room, leg room in front. The president's body slumped down there, and she fell down over him. And she accompanied him to the hospital. She helped take his body from the car and place it on a stretcher, which carried it into the emergency section of the hospital. And a bouquet of yellow roses, which had been presented to her upon her arrival at the airport in Dallas, was still on the back seat of the car, which by this time, of course, bore the blood stains. That she went in the hospital, and that she was informed of the president's death, that there was no hysterics, that she bore up remarkably well under these staggering circumstances. Her whereabouts at this precise moment, I would suppose she is on the plane with the president's body returning to Washington. She was present at the swearing in of President Lyndon Johnson, along with the new First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Lady Bird Johnson. So, what had set out to be quite a new experience for her, and something that she might enjoy considerably, has turned into the utmost tragedy. This is a picture of President Kennedy shaking hands with well-wishers on his arrival in Texas, and in the background, if you could make it out, with a little black pillbox hat and the hair falling over her right eye, and her hand at her waist, is a beaming Mrs. Kennedy.
I would guess that would be the Air Force Base where they flew in today, Frank, to Fort Worth. There's this report. We are going back over material you may have heard before, then again you may not. But it was said by doctors at Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas who were in the emergency room where the president was brought, we never had any hope of saving his life. It is also reported by a New York Times reporter that the priest who administered the last rites of the Catholic Church to President Kennedy said that the president was already dead when he, the priest, arrived in the hospital. The Very Reverend Oscar Huber said he had to draw back a sheet that was covering the president's face so he could begin administering the sacrament of extreme unction. This indicates, I think, again, the intense power of the weapon used,